Good evening, everyone. Tonight is a journey into mind. Please be my willing guest. I'll start with an icebreaker. It was through and by philosophy that all science that we know of was discovered and known. Had we not that philosophy, we would not have discovered all the science. It is therefore logical that the advancement of science must come from the advancement of philosophy. It's undeniable. So, let us journey into mind and advance our philosophy. What I have today for everybody, interesting little book that I have written. I'm going to read 35 pages. This is just the sampler. I call it simply, for whatever reason, the Book of the Sword. So, let us begin. It doesn't matter if you're a religious person, doesn't matter if you're the Pope, doesn't matter if you're the biggest atheist, the biggest anti-God that ever existed, your mind will be blown by this philosophy. Blown as in the mind will be expanded, be blown right out of its box. You'll be journeying into regions unknown. So here we go. The style of my book, I didn't have one thing in particular in mind. I just let it flow and expand. So there's no particular order to things. And it's written, not cryptically, but it's written like a puzzle. It is designed to invoke thought and consideration and analysis. It is not written like a picture book for children where you gobble down everything at face value. You will find cleverly masqueraded sarcasm. You will find great questions that will cast you out into this labyrinth, which is the mind. So let us begin. If I say the word if, remember what I said. I could be asking you, the audience, a sarcastic question, which is provoking you to search for an answer for yourself. So I'm going to start with a quote that I have that starts off my little book here. So, and it's my own quote. If there were no questions, there would be no answers. Think about that. If there were no questions, there would be no answers. So let me begin. If we can muster the dignity, we should fathom philosophy so that we can make sense of our predicament. We exist and are subject to this world and its invisible laws. A two-edged sword, it is like. For on one side is enjoyment and life, but on the other there is suffering and death. Why does such a world exist? Should decay and death exist? Must they? Must enjoyment be mingled with suffering? Must birth be met with death? If we do not use all our power to fathom our predicament, then we are like a dumb rock watching ages pass. Is consciousness a product or the producer? Do we create the experience or are we victim to it? By philosophy, we go from banging rocks to climbing to stars. By discernment, we can perceive things unseen and read the pages of the invisible book of reality. And what mind of nature crafted such a tool? Does nature seek to discern itself? If consciousness is the producer, why is it producing all this? And by what laws is it bound to? If consciousness is the product, can a product think about its producer? Does a ripple think about the pebble which made it? If a product is conscious, how is it different than the producer if it can produce? And if it can produce, is it really just a product? If the product can produce, then the product is a producer. And it is only an illusion by nearsighted mind that such a product be just a product, even though it produces. A puddle is just rain that has stopped falling. Is the puddle not rain? The rain is the visible component and the tangible. The movement itself is invisible, but the water moves. If the raindrop was to hit you, you feel the water, not the movement itself. Is the rain the producer and the puddle the product? Or is the puddle the producer and the falling the product? The falling itself is nothing. It is the raindrop that is a thing. Movement is the product. As take a sip of my coffee. The falling itself is nothing. It is the raindrop that is a thing. And ironically, there's rain in the music now. So I'll say it again for my little interim where I clear my throat. The falling itself is nothing. It is the raindrop that is a thing. Movement is the product. As a bee produces the buzzing of its wings, consciousness produces the buzzing. The buzzing is not consciousness itself. The buzzing is the ripple in the water, and the bee produces the cause of the ripple. The nature of reality permits the rippling according to the invisible laws which have been produced. So why does this world exist? It does exist, that much we readily know, but it takes a mind to know it exists. Without any minds to know it exists, does it exist? Or does it only exist in those minds? What other worlds exist that minds have not yet comprehended? The ripple exists because of the pebble, not the pebble because of the ripple. The buzz exists because of the bee, not the bee because of the buzz. Truly, if no minds existed to perceive a given reality, then it is as if that reality did not exist, since there would be no mind actually perceiving it. Even if it did exist, nobody would know or be able to verify. And like I said earlier, what other worlds exist that minds have not yet comprehended? Yet all minds in this reality can verify that this reality must exist, as we are all living it and subject to it. And as the ripple does not perceive the pebble, so do we cause the ripples. How can we, if inferior, to the greater reality perceive the greater reality when the greater reality does not perceive itself? What mind of nature created such a tool as the perception of conscious minds? If nature is not a mind, if nature is not a mind, and if mind is a producer, then nature is the product of mind. Otherwise, if nature is a producing mind and our minds produce, then movement is the product of both. If movement is the product, then something must produce it, and the movement must operate according to the invisible principles in order for it to occur. How can we see the invisible principles that we may know them? You cannot see what is invisible. You can only see the effects it produces on other things. Therefore, you can only see products and not producers. Energy is not needed for movement. For if it was, then how did the very first thing move? Yet energy is movement by its own composition. How could the very first thing require energy to produce the very first movement when movement is required for the basis and substance of energy itself? You see, movement is required for energy, and space is required for movement. What else then is required for movement? A direction for movement must exist, and the distance of which the movement will occur over. Where does the direction come from but choice? In a boundless void, all direction is arbitrary, for there is no left or right. Traveling in one direction all the way will not take you past an edge or to an end or back to the start. Do we exist in a boundless void? Is not all direction arbitrary? You may say, but I can look forward and backward. But to where are you looking? Whilst direction is arbitrary, distance has measure. But measure is arbitrary, but distance has measure. Distance moved is by a produced measure. One does not walk nor run further than they need or want to. A bowl rolls until it has nowhere else to roll. Rain falls until it meets a surface. When the purpose is served, the movement stops. You need space to move, and you need movement for energy, and you need energy for mass. I mean, if I hadn't said it already, when you zoom into energy, everything's moving, everything's spinning, right? There's movement, okay? I do say that later, but anyways, right? You need space to move, and you need movement for energy, and you need energy for mass. You cannot have mass without energy, and you cannot have energy without movement. You cannot have movement without space. And if there was no mind to exist to perceive that space, then does that space exist? Like I said before, that space only exists because of that mind perceiving it. That mind must have created space by displacing itself, the mind, to multiple loci at meted distances. As no energy is needed for movement, but movement is needed to create energy, that mind could simultaneously spawn its consciousness itself at multiple loci. By this multilocation and thus multiplication of that mind was space thus created amidst the boundless void. And thus, once multiple loci were established at set distances, there was an expanse with dimension known to us as space. Until something moves, it is like there is no time. Such is seen with the universe itself. Thus, from movement comes perception of time, and from movement comes multiple locations which create a space. The mind which produced or witnessed this all was the first pebble upon the water surface. It was the first bee to utter a hum. It was the one which pushed the ball from its place and set it rolling. This mind cannot be seen, as with other producers, nor can it be measured nor divided, but it verily exists, and it is the one which sees and measures and causes division, for it is a producer. Mind can create movement, but movement cannot create mind. Thus, the mind that first existed was and is the first and primal element, so to speak. All other elements were begat from this mind, the primal elements of location, direction, space, time, energy, and matter. The mind existed in a location which was the one and only location before any space existed, and the mind created space through the multilocation of itself. When the mind first moved is when perceivable time first began. As the space was the product of mere multilocation of the mind itself, the planes of space created were part of the mind itself. By inducing movement by mind, the mind created energy and then mass, all from the mind itself. For no written laws of nature had yet existed, and how could they? All particles are construct of the mind, this primal mind, whom is regarded as God. We look at a planet and zoom in closer, we see matter of various forms and masses, and we zoom in further, looking deeper, and see the matter and mass are energy particles moving. These particles, all particles, are constructs of this mind. They are the medium or matrix on which all becomes manifest in diverse forms and are only existent because of this mind and are not foreign to it. As when dreaming, one can make a table of food appear and start eating and enjoying the savory foods from out of nowhere, so can this mind make all that is apparent appear. It is like all this universe is in the mind of this God, and only has existence in the mind of this God. The only reason we experience it is because we are fragmentary portions of the same primordial mind. And what is this mind? The cosmic field, the cosmic mold, the cosmic thinker, the cosmic being? Mind is not a substance that undergoes actions. It is something which produces substance and action. The mind creates a home for itself and fills that home and operates it. The mind creates a zone of operation, and there is no mind outside of this zone. Only this mind in its own zone. As we are all minds, we are in this zone, and thus part of that mind, which is God. Even if existing minds all differ and occupy differing forms, it is no wonder, for even the water which is in the ocean is also the same water which is snow or ice or glaciers or rain or fog or mist or steam or spring water. The various forms are all but one thing, water, in various states of expression under varying conditions. From the boiling waters and their hot vapors, to the gentle dew in cool mornings, to the hard ice of a mountain peak, these are all one, but in differing places and states of expression, due to the interference of the invisible principles that exist, which themselves are thoughts of the God mind, and in decisions which in turn last and affect all else within their zone of operation to the satisfaction of the God mind. You need mind to have space, and you need space to have movement, and you need movement to have energy, and you need energy to have mass. Yet the mind itself is no thing. As with space, it is no thing, and movement is no thing. Mass also is no thing. All are invisible, intangible, and do not exist as things, but perhaps forces or such. Energy is particles moving. If they were not moving, there would be no energy. Thus, the particles are not energy, but them moving is what we call energy. Thus, energy is the movement, which is a no thing, and not the particle itself. The particles are the matrix on which forces act out. So the only thing that exists are these particles. Only the particles are visible to us, as all else is invisible and like a no thing. We only know that the no things exist because of the effects that they have on the particles. This reinforces that these no things are forces. Yet particles are defined as things because they have shape. However, this would suggest that forces hold their constituent parts together into those shapes, and that these forces dictate their behaviors. Therefore, the particles are themselves a perceived effect of the invisible forces, and they themselves do not truly exist as things. Thus, all these things are invisible, except for those which are perceived effects, which are the results of the invisible forces. Thus, the matrix of particles is merely a visual field, and thus the matrix of particles is a created visible effect by which its design is viewable to minds, so that some of the invisible can be visible, as with invisible sun rays hitting transparent water, creating the rainbow. If mass is super dense energy, so to speak, then it is super dense movement, because if you zoom in on that energy, everything's moving. So if mass is super dense energy, then it is super dense movement, with high exertion of continual forces at work, navigating a set perimeter of space. Then where did all the forces come from? And if they are all forces, then this suggests that they all work by a shared common underlying principle, which enables them to exist and to behave and to affect things as forces. This underlying principle of force in general itself is decision of that mind. The mind, that primordial mind, which we call God, decides, and the decision acting out is a force. Thus, the mind decided to create a visual field by creating super dense movement over a grid of traversable space. I'm going to say that again. Thus, the mind decided to create a visual field by creating super dense movement over a grid of traversable space. All of those constituent parts are invisible, but by interacting, you produce something that is visible. So, energy is the currency of mass, but it is not the currency of mind. Mind is the producer of energy. Mind creates space to induce movement in order to create energy, which subsequently induces mass. So why does mind occupy bodies? Like I said, sometimes I jump around the topic, right? So why does mind occupy bodies? Good question. As in our case, why is it bound and not free roaming? We know it can be released from this bond, as with death, so it is not an inescapable or permanent bond. It is a bond which is default to us by birth, but a bond which can be freed. However, mortality of our mass body is linked to this bond. So why as minds are we born into our mass bodies as such, and then subject to suffering and death? Was it a choice we made? But why the memory obscuration at our birth? Are we the victims of a tyrannical evil being, or the prisoners of a just God? Or perhaps both? Did we end up here inadvertently or unintentionally, or is it part of a natural flux? Or perhaps intentionally we came here to be subjected to this? If mind is created in the womb or embryo, then what mind was the first womb or embryo, meaning the mind of the mother of that womb or embryo? Good question. If mind is created in the womb or embryo, then what mind was the first womb or embryo, which begat all others? Mind is not a product, it is the producer. No mind would intentionally subject itself to this birth and world of suffering and death, surely. It is not logical that something would flux between life and death, and nor is it logical that all the mortal life here on this planet alone would have all inadvertently come here somehow together. It is also not logical that we are exclusively the victims of an evil tyrannical being, as our memories are wiped at birth. It makes the most sense out of these options aforesaid that we are here as prisoners of a just God. Yet the fact that we can free the bond shows that our imprisonment, as such, is related to some aspect of the ability to free that bond. It may be that we caused this bond upon ourselves and thus suffer the consequences for it. Or maybe we as mind did exist before the womb, but this mortal life is a required first initiatory step to immortality. However, this is highly illogical, as death does not strengthen life, nor does it beget life. How can consciousness be the product of chemical reactions when science says that genetic memory is stored in our DNA? Memory is one of the core processes and attributes of mind, yet if it occurs in DNA, then why does the rest of our consciousness result from chemical reactions elsewhere in the body? Consciousness cannot be the result of many reactions occurring in tandem from various sources and localities. Our consciousness and mind undeniably are centered in our head, yet our DNA is everywhere in our body. And other chemical reactions occur throughout the body which do not bear relevance to our consciousness. If all organs of the body perform chemical reactions and contain DNA, then why does the mind only express itself as manifest in the head? What is particular to the head which would serve as a seat of consciousness? Is it because the brain is akin to an organizer? Rather, it would be because commands for the body emanate from the brain. Or is it because the consciousness, being considered as separate from flesh and body, is situated in this area, that the commands and such emit from this locality? How can non-intelligent chemical reactions work in tandem to inadvertently create consciousness and its ability to decide, will, remember, and imagine? I'm just going to say that one again, right? How can non-intelligent chemical reactions work in tandem to inadvertently create consciousness and its ability to decide, will, remember, and imagine? Even if the unlikely chance that a primordial conglomerate of tandem chemical reactions beget consciousness in the first brain, what principle would cause or allow this new fantastic trait to be held as constant and fixed, and to pass on to subsequent offspring and to all other forms of conscious life? Why would it spread as such? If nature is non-conscious, as science alleges, but if nature is non-conscious, then what would cause a produced effect of consciousness to be a desirable trait of natural selection? If science wants to convince us that all conscious life forms evolved from mere unconscious bacteria and such, then why do bacteria and such simple organisms exist today as the oldest forms of life on Earth? Such would suggest that natural selection favored non-consciousness for bacteria and such, and hence why they existed allegedly first, but yet still exist billions of years later, virtually unchanged and still lacking consciousness. Science has to claim consciousness arose from the evolution of bacteria and such because they do not want to consider that mind existed prior to any form of physical life. Yet to this very day, after billions of years of opportunity, no plant or bacteria or such has evolved to possess a mind, despite having more time to evolve such than compared to all other forms of life. Furthermore, it must be pointed out that life is a separate issue than mind, as all can agree that plants and such live but do not have mind. So this makes two separate and fantastic things for science to explain as rising out of nature. People consider rocks as not living, and whilst they do not live or have mind, their chemicals and constituent particles are all very active and in high degrees of movement at an atomic and subatomic scale. So such activity arose, meaning the atomic and subatomic activity. So the activity arose, and also life and mind. This activity, like I just said, atomic, subatomic, exists even in non-living things. And life exists even in things which have no mind. Mind exists in living things which have such atomic and such activity, but mind does not exist in non-living things or things which lack any activity. Does mind require the presence of life? Yes. Does it require the presence of such atomic activity? Yes, because life requires the presence of such activity. However, despite this, mind does not require a body or physical matter. A physical body requires atomic activity in order to live, but a mind does not need such activity to exist. If mind needs a body, then this is a good question. If mind needs a body, then is the body created for the mind, or is the mind created for the body? If the body is created for the mind, this would suggest that the mind existed prior to the body. If mind is created for the body, then this shows design. And in such a case, what or who was the designer? How can nature design mind when nature itself has no mind, according to science? How can nature, design something that it does not allegedly possess? Is mind that convenient to nature that natural selection favored minds during epochs of evolution? What has mind done for nature? Does the human body suddenly produce a new hormone which afflicts the body over time? No. The body has evolved to its current state through better perfecting its genetic and chemical operations, not through favoring random production of new or partially hostile constituent parts. This is why it is improbable that a mindless nature would create and favor evolutionary propagation of such elements which could afflict it, meaning mind, or are of no direct value to it. If mind was favorable to evolution, then we would see life throughout the cosmos, everywhere, given the vast immeasurable epochs of time to evolve in which they possessed. However, we in fact see that life itself is rare in the cosmos, and that mind is even more rare. For example, on our own planet, only a small portion of living things possess mind. In our solar system, life only exists on one planet out of many. Mind is therefore not favorable to evolution in the scenario of a mindless nature. So if nature is mindless, considering all of this, then why does mind exist? Right? So if nature is mindless, considering all of this, then why does mind exist? However, if nature has mind, such as with God, there is a solution. In the vastness of the cosmos, immeasurable numbers of planetary bodies exist which are devoid of life. Yet life and mind exist in many. It is like finding a field of oysters, but only a few have pearls. The pearls are not favorable to a mindless oyster, nor even to a minded oyster. However, shells are favorable to oysters, and hence all the oysters have shells. How is mind favorable to nature? So if nature is mindless, it makes no sense that mind would evolve as favorable given the vast epochs of time which have already passed. and thus it makes no sense for mind, in all its glorious complexity, to evolve into existence at all if nature is mindless. However, if nature has or is mind, then it would make sense that other loci of mind would propagate and populate the vast regions of the cosmos as being irrelevant to the natural order of evolution which has and does occur. Because that's physical. As you cannot trap air in water, you cannot trap mind in matter. Both want to rise up and out. Air can be temporarily held in water through pressure, but it will eventually rise when the pressure gives up. If mind was to be functionally situated or housed in a body, it would have to be a living body, which has life, and thus having the atomic and subatomic activity. So it is the activity as such which binds the mind to the body temporarily, as if by a pressure. At bodily death, this bond is broken, and the mind is not bound to it anymore, as the life and activity have ceased. It is important to note that life does not mean it possesses mind. Rather, the mind requires the life to be bound to that body. So death frees it from the body, and life binds it to the body. What is the association of the mind binding to a living body? The same association of an engineer who creates a vehicle to drive and operate. A machine, good point here, a machine does not create a user. The user creates the machine. The machine does not use the user uses the machine. It's going to get deep now. A robot is a robot until it realizes that it is a robot. Then it has become more than a robot. Is nature and the cosmos explained as a room of robots, which all self-assembled from bare natural elements, who then suddenly became conscious that they are robots? This makes no sense, but is what science alleges to be. Rather, an engineer designed and constructed the room for the robots and built the robots, which then became conscious through the engineer inserting a loci of mind into them. After all, what is mind but merely the ability to exist, experience, think, and do? That's all. What benefit would it be to a mindless nature to create experience or thought? Really, right? However, a minded nature, i.e. God, but a minded nature could and would propagate loci of mind which can experience and think and do. After all, how can a mindless nature create the existence of mind? Why would it? How can a room of robots realize they are robots if they have no mind? If mind is the greatest natural thing, then why can it be destroyed so easily? Such as a volcano erupting and wiping out all life on a planet, or a meteor doing such. Why would the greatest natural thing, i.e. mind, be so fragile if it were the glorious apex of evolutionary product of a mindless nature? Diamond is such a glorious apex amidst gems in terms of hardness, and thus atomic and such activity, but diamonds are not fragile, but boast great resilience. Since mind is so powerful and unique, rare, and in such a sense fragile, it makes more sense that it exists because it was put here, situated by a situator, which would be the nature mind, i.e., which we call God. As with rare, unique, medicinal plants or flowers, beautiful flowers, they are planted in gardens, whereas common plants of no use or benefit are removed from gardens. Therefore, if nature was mindless, it would have removed mind through natural selection. If nature was mindless, it would have removed mind. So even if mind showed up, nature over time would have removed mind. And it would have removed mind then it would never have, and if it would have removed mind, then it never would have created mind to start with. However, because nature is minded, it would plant minds because it creates mind. Mind cannot be the product of mindless particles, as life cannot be the product of death. And what is death but the ceasing of life and atomic activity? So anyways, that is 35 pages of my Book of the Sword. So hope that expanded your brains, everybody. God bless you all.